Welcome back to Live and Thrive with Endo. This is Module 6, Circadian Rhythm, Sleep and HPA Axis Dysfunction. Today's lesson is Lesson 3, HPA Axis Dysfunction. In this lesson, you will learn what the HPA axis is, how HPA axis dysregulation affects our circadian rhythm, and the impact of stress on our sex hormones. So let's kick off with an introduction to the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, otherwise known as the HPA axis. The HPA axis is a system responsible for our stress response and our sleep-wake cycle. It consists of the hypothalamus, which is in the brain at the base of the brain, the pituitary gland, which is in the brain as well in the base as well, and the adrenal glands, which are found above the kidneys. In times of stress, the flight or fight response is turned on via the HPA axis system. In the simplest of terms, the hypothalamus alerts the pituitary, which alerts the adrenals. The adrenals then release adrenaline, cortisol, and DHEA. Following activation from the HPA axis, adrenaline and cortisol then increase blood flow to the organs like the heart, brain, and muscles, and reduce blood flow from the non-essential organs like the digestive tract and the reproductive system, and trigger the release of stored glucose and fat so you have the energy to run or fight. Adrenaline is released quickly and subsides quickly, whereas cortisol is released after adrenaline and stays with us for longer to help us power through the remaining stress. This is where things can get a bit messy. Cortisol is an absolutely essential hormone, and so is the stress response. Without them, humans just wouldn't have been able to evolve or survive. But cortisol can have some damaging effects in the long term, and so the hormone DHEA is also released during a stress response to buffer those negative effects of cortisol. If the HPA axis is chronically stimulated, this can lead to detrimental health effects due to the long-term exposure of high cortisol levels, such as chronic inflammation, suppressed immune function, and increased blood sugar. Eventually, DHEA also begins to lower when cortisol remains this high, so those protective properties of DHEA are also reduced. Now, in today's society, many things are a stressor on the body. Originally, the HPA axis was designed to keep us safe from real life-threatening situations, like being chased by lions or attacked by another tribe. Unfortunately, the HPA axis hasn't evolved to tailor its response to less life-threatening situations, and it's kicked into action by anything that is stressful, such as lack of sleep, inflammation, blood sugar dysregulation, caffeine, illnesses and infections, emails, social media, endless to-do lists. You get the picture. As a result, the body eventually adapts to protect itself. The high levels of cortisol in the body trigger a feedback loop in the brain, which encourages the brain to lower cortisol output, and potentially the adrenals may also become resistant to the signals from the brain to make more cortisol. I think we may see some more mechanisms to how this works over time, as they're discovering new ways HPA axis occurs and affects the body in research at the moment. And I just wanted to add a quick note here. You might recognize this as adrenal fatigue, and you may have heard science basically saying adrenal fatigue isn't real, and that's because adrenal fatigue is a very simplified term and incorrect term for what is actually happening with the HPA axis. The adrenals don't get fatigued, they don't get burnt out. It's just that loop, that HPA axis, the trio dysregulates and the cortisol output is dysregulated. So there are no studies on adrenal fatigue, but there are tons of studies on HPA axis dysfunction. It is very, very real. So to understand how HPA axis affects us, we now need to look at circadian rhythm. The circadian rhythm is our inner body clock responsible for our sleep-wake cycle. It's literally what gets you up in the mornings and allows you to sleep at night. The HPA axis orchestrates the circadian rhythm with the release of cortisol. Cortisol elevates in the morning to wake us up, peaks after an hour of waking, and gradually falls with a fairly sharp dip in the afternoon before petering out in the evening to allow us to sleep. As cortisol falls, melatonin, our sleep hormone, rises, and if cortisol is high, melatonin is suppressed. Here's what this would look like if you were to measure your cortisol output on a graph. This is known as your cortisol awakening response. So you can see here, if you follow the green line, that cortisol is rising and peaking at around 7 a.m. by the looks of it, and then is falling evenly with a sharp dip and then diminishing into the night. It's important to note that this is a general pattern, but times may differ as we all have different circadian rhythms. For example, your circadian rhythm may be set to rise at 8 a.m., which I see with a lot of my clients, and they tend to feel better with later mornings. And I see some dips happening kind of more around 2 or 3 rather than that 12 o'clock mark there. Now, let's look at high cortisol, which is a form of HPA axis dysfunction. If we've been chronically stressed, we may have elevated cortisol levels, which can go on for a number of weeks to years in some cases. This will affect our circadian rhythm, often causing cortisol to elevate at night or begin to rise higher than usual in the morning, affecting sleep. This causes symptoms like anxiety, feeling wired yet exhausted, and often overwhelmed. People with high cortisol often feel like they can't switch off, that they have racing thoughts. They might suddenly get a burst of energy or wakefulness at night. They might find themselves wide awake all of a sudden at 2 a.m. or have trouble sleeping or can't fall asleep at all. So, if you were to get your levels tested, they may look something like this if you're looking at the black dots here. You can see how high the levels are in the morning and then they rise back up at night. Now, eventually, in most people, that cortisol will get dampened. I've seen it take years for some people. They keep going and going and going, and then they hit a brick wall. But recent research has shown it can happen in a number of weeks as well. So we can end up with low levels at either some points of the day, low levels all day, but high cortisol at night, and that's known as a flipped curve, or low levels all the time, which is when we're really fatigued, and that's what you're seeing in this graph here. Following the black dots again, you can see they're very, very low. People's HPA axis dysregulation tends to vary from person to person, so yours may not look like this. I've linked in the slides to different cortisol scenarios, and they also have some helpful extra tips for each type of dysregulation. But generally, everything I'm going to take you through will address all of these types. So these are the signs of HPA axis dysfunction: chronic fatigue, brain fog, waking up tired no matter how much sleep you get, feel unable to cope with everyday stresses, continuous feelings of overwhelm as the body struggles to respond adequately to stress, anxiety and depression, blood sugar dysregulation, exercise intolerance, so you find it hard to do much exercise or you find it difficult to recover afterwards. You get ill easily. You might have dizziness, especially when going from seated to standing. Frequent energy crashes, especially mid-morning and mid-afternoon as cortisol begins to fall. Insomnia, disturbed sleep, or feeling suddenly energized at night. And this would, of course, be more likely if your cortisol was creeping up at night. When I share these symptoms, this is like a light bulb moment for my clients. Nearly all of them say they recognize all or most of these symptoms in themselves. If you'd like to test your cortisol levels, you're looking for a cortisol awakening response test, which tests your cortisol levels across a day with a saliva test. You'll ideally need to avoid taking during ovulation, as morning levels are slightly higher at this time. Just take that into account when testing. The Dutch card test is one of the best. You can fairly easily get a card saliva test from most private labs. I've linked to a few in the sides. I will say avoid blood tests as they do not correctly record cortisol levels. You certainly don't need to test your levels to implement the changes I'm going to recommend in the next lesson, as they're all general healthy lifestyle changes. But if you find it helpful and motivating, it could be worth the cost, which is around £200. Now have a look at what messed up cortisol can do to our hormones. As you can see by now, HPA axis dysfunction can of course make you feel terrible and worsen symptoms of endo like more severe fatigue and brain fog, but it can also affect our hormones too. To put it briefly, the stress response deliberately wants to prevent the body from conceiving, because as far as the body is concerned, times of threat are not times to be having a baby, which of course makes sense if we look back at evolution. Getting pregnant wouldn't have been wise during times of famine or if we're at risk from the elements or predators. In short, stress can lower sex hormones, especially progesterone and thyroid hormones, as you'll come to see in a moment. So let's start with all the ways that cortisol can play a role. Now, this does get a bit complex, so I've tried to simplify it all. And if you'd like to do further research and reading, I've provided a few links. But as you've heard me say before, you don't need to remember these sciencey bits, just the outcome of them. So, cortisol drives resources away from the reproductive system, as you heard earlier in this lesson, directing resources to essential organs like the heart and brain. Cortisol also lowers production of sex hormones in the ovaries by indirectly lowering follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone is the hormone which tells the follicles to start maturing, which in turn makes estrogen, and luteinizing hormone is directly involved in raising testosterone and triggering ovulation, which, as you now know, is then what makes progesterone. To be double sure we can't get pregnant, cortisol makes the ovaries resistant to follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone so that we can't develop eggs or ovulate. Cortisol also blocks progesterone by locking into cell receptors. If you were to imagine progesterone and cortisol as keys, they'd look pretty similar. That means that cortisol can fit into progesterone receptors, or the locks, in cells, shutting progesterone out, meaning our progesterone can't do its job. So even if you did manage to ovulate and make some progesterone, cortisol is now barging progesterone out of the way. Finally, cortisol also suppresses thyroid hormones, which, as we know from our earlier lesson rather, can cause symptoms like fatigue, brain fog, etc. So you may not have a thyroid disorder, but your stress levels are pushing you in that direction. Now, this won't happen with our normal healthy ranges of cortisol in our circadian rhythm. The stress response is triggered by stress, and temporarily it's not a problem. It's what's supposed to happen. But if this is chronic and continuous, then hormone imbalances begin. Next up is the impact of lower DHEA as a result of chronically high cortisol levels. DHEA is actually the precursor to estrogen and testosterone, meaning it gives birth to estrogen and testosterone. So if DHEA is low, these hormones will struggle too, and as both are involved in ovulation, lowered levels could prevent it. Finally, let's look at adrenaline. Adrenaline hinders follicle development and ovulation by directly heading to the ovaries and interrupting development. As we've discussed in previous modules, if we don't ovulate, we don't make progesterone, which creates all of those symptoms of estrogen dominance. All of these issues can result in menstrual cycle problems such as late, irregular, or missing periods due to the delay in ovulation, and extensive spotting, especially before or after your period, periods that stop and start, worsening PMS, and fertility problems due to the low progesterone and other hormonal imbalances. The lowered thyroid issues can also present as hypothyroid symptoms and cause menstrual problems as well. One thing I want to make clear here is that having a period does not mean you've ovulated. You can still have a period even if you don't ovulate, and we'll explore how to track whether you've actually ovulated in Module 8. If you'd like to test your hormones to find out exactly what's going on, a Dutch test would give you an accurate picture of your hormone levels. However, keep in mind that progesterone levels may look normal, but the progesterone isn't actually being used by the body as cortisol is blocking the cell receptors. So it's just hanging around in your body and being picked up by the tests, but you don't actually have progesterone doing its job. Also, testing isn't always necessary. If you're presenting with signs of hormonal imbalances and you know you've been under a lot of stress, then working on that will improve, if not eradicate, these symptoms, alongside eating for blood sugar balancing and giving your detoxification processes a boost. If you then don't find your symptoms are improving or you just really want to know, go for testing. You can get the Dutch test for just your sex hormones or the Dutch test plus, which also measures your CAR, or your cortisol awakening response. The key takeaway here is that cortisol in normal levels is healthy, but high levels cause HPA axis dysregulation, hormonal imbalances, and worsening symptoms like brain fog and fatigue. Don't worry about the science of it. Just remember that long term stress will explain those period problems and feelings of exhaustion and brain fog. So, to recap, in this lesson, you learned what HPA axis is, how HPA axis dysregulation affects our circadian rhythm, and the impact of stress on our sex hormones. Hop over to the Facebook group and share with us what you learned in this lesson, whether you recognise the symptoms of HPA axis dysregulation in yourself, and have you ever had a really rough period after a stressful time. When you're ready, I'll see you in the next lesson where you'll learn the key strategies for HPA axis recovery, how to change your mindset around stress, and additional strategies for supporting HPA axis recovery.